Hi everybody, and welcome back to another video. In today's video, we are discussing chapter 2 of Matthew's Gospel, and we're going to do verses 1 through 12. And this is a pretty familiar story. Let me get rid of all my underlining business here. We'll get to that in a second. It's a pretty familiar story, whether or not you grew up in a Christian home or not, because every Christmas around that time, this story gets told. And so most people know about it. It's the story of the wise men coming to see Jesus. So what I want to do, I don't want to go text or verse by verse in this study. I just want to point out a few important points that we can learn from this narrative. Let's read verses 1 through 12 together. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where Jesus was to be born. And they told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." And then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word, that I too may come and worship him." After listening to the words of the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then, opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. So, a few important points that I want to talk about here. A couple of them are misconceptions. And they're misconceptions probably just because we're so familiar with Christian artwork or illustrations, and they've kind of beat that into our mind. Also, Christian tradition is a very strong thing, and when something gets kind of rolled up in tradition, sometimes we can forget to look at the text of the Bible, and we just kind of go on these stories or the things that are told to us over and over and over again. It's important to look at the text to find out what the truth is about any story, and it's always good to go back to the text, even when you think you know a story. So, one very interesting thing about kind of the way that many people look at the nativity, the birth of Jesus, is that they believe that these wise men kind of show up right after Jesus is born. So, the shepherds come, and then they're like, "Oh, well, the wise men pop their head in the door right after the shepherds." But when we look at the text, that actually doesn't seem to be the case. And let me show you why. Look at verse 1. Verse 1 kind of gives us a timeline for all these events that we just read about. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea. So, all these events seem to take place after Jesus is born. The wise men traveling to Jerusalem, having a conversation with Herod, then traveling to Bethlehem, and that would have taken some time, probably, multiple days, maybe weeks. And so it doesn't seem that the wise men showed up to the manger. And that's evidenced again in verse 11. Look at verse 11 with me. When they follow the star, they rejoice that it's finally taken them where they want to go. And it says, and they went into the house. Now, we know that Jesus wasn't born in a house because there wasn't any room when Joseph and Mary showed up and it was time to go. Here, the wise men, what we find is that they actually go into a house to meet Jesus, not to the manger, like so many stories and illustrations and Christmas scenes depict. Another misconception is that there were only 3 wise men. There may have been only 3 wise men, and I think a lot of people get that idea because they came with 3 different gifts, one gift for each wise man. But the Bible actually never says that there were just 3. It could have been 3. I guess there could have been 2. There could have been 15. It just doesn't tell us. I don't know of anybody who tries to bind the fact that there were 3 wise men, but just an interesting point because you always see 3. The next point that I'd like to point out, or I have a question that I'd like to ask the text. My question would be, how did they know about this star? There's a lot of messianic prophecies in the Old Testament, but unless I'm wrong, and if you know better than me, comment down below. I know of absolutely no prophecies or descriptions of signs that talk about a star appearing when Jesus was born. And if anybody knew about the Old Testament scriptures and what they prophesied, it would be the Jews, right? The high priests, the scribes. But it seems like they don't know either, because look at verse 3. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And he assembled all the chief priests and the scribes of the people, and he was, asking them questions. If anybody would have known about this, certainly the Jews you would think would have known about this, but none of them do. And as we look at the Old Testament, we can't find it. And so how did the wise men, who were people from the east, maybe like around the area of Persia, how did they know about this? My best explanation is that this must have been some kind of selective revelation given by God, where he chose to reveal this to some particular people, we don't know how many, and that they knew about it and others didn't. That's not inconsistent with the Bible and what we read about in the rest of the Old Testament. It's important to remember that the Old Testament is a story. It is the history of the Jews and how the Redeemer, Jesus, comes through the Jewish line. And so it records all the history of the Jews. I think it's very easy sometimes to get caught up in the idea that the Bible records all of God's dealings throughout the entire world. But there's not really any evidence to suggest that that's true. There's not any evidence to suggest that God didn't have any kind of relation or reveal anything to any other nations outside the Jews. And so I think that's probably what we have here. God revealed this. We don't know when, we don't know how, but these wise men knew about it and came to see Jesus when he was born. It's also kind of interesting what form this star took. The wise men talk about the star appearing and how they saw it, but the Jews, they don't seem to be able to see the star, at least when it first rises, as the Bible says, because Herod has to ask the wise men. He said, "When did the star get here? when did it appear? When did you realize what you were doing?" And they have to tell him when the star appeared. He apparently doesn't have a knowledge of it, and so a lot of times we have a picture in our mind that this star just kind of hung over the house where Jesus was and stayed there, and maybe you could see it from several miles around. But that doesn't seem to be the case. The star perhaps began in the east and led the wise men to Jerusalem and then led them to Bethlehem, but it doesn't seem to have just stayed above the house where Jesus was. We actually know that that's true because when the wise men leave Herod's presence, let's see, in verse 9, after listening to the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star that they had seen, when it rose, went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. So it's almost as if the star rose again. From where exactly? We're not told. But once they got to Jerusalem, it rose again as they were leaving and then guided them the rest of the way. And then it kind of camped over the house where Jesus was. So some really interesting questions that, that get brought to mind when you take a close look at this passage. Some of the answers to those questions, I just don't think we have, but it's interesting to look at them and to kind of compare our Christian illustrations and the things that tradition puts into our mind with the actual text of the Bible and what that looks like. So if you've got any answers to those questions, I'd love to hear them. You can comment down below. Maybe you have an alternative answer other than special revelation. Love to hear it. So thanks for joining me. we find in verse 12, then, our very last verse, that the wise men decide that they're not going to go home the same way because God warns them in a dream that Herod is up to no good. And that's true. And so Herod is now going to essentially order a genocide. And we'll look at that in our next Bible study. So come back. That should be interesting. Thanks.